The island did not begin with a crown. It began with something far older and far less certain, the desperate, grinding need to survive another season, another raid, another king who might turn on you before morning. Long before anyone called this land England, it was a place that ate its rulers. The people who had lived here longest, the Britons, shaped by Roman occupation and then abandoned by it, had barely finished watching the legions sail away before new peoples began arriving from across the sea. The Anglo-Saxons came in waves through the 5th and 6th centuries, not as a single conquering army but as families, clans, and war bands, each one pushing further into a land that was already occupied, already scarred, already tired of being remade by strangers. They brought everything with them, their cattle, their gods, their feuds. They cleared the old Roman towns and let the stone walls crumble back into the earth. They built in wood. They planted fields. They named the rivers and the hills and the low wet meadows in their own tongue, a language that sounds almost alien now but that lives quietly inside the English, spoken every day in the words for earth, for fire, for night, for death. What they did not bring was unity. That was the one thing the island lacked, and the one thing it needed most. Instead, they built a patchwork of small kingdoms that shifted and struggled against each other with a persistence that was almost admirable in its stubbornness. Mercia held the middle of the country and fought with everyone. Northumbria stretched across the north and produced great scholars and terrible kings in roughly equal measure. East Anglia sat on the flat eastern coast and was rich enough to be worth attacking and never quite strong enough to stop it. Wessex lay in the south and west, a kingdom of chalk hills and long river valleys, and it was here that the story of England, the real story, would eventually begin. A king in this world did not sit on a throne and issue decrees. A king rode and fought and ate with his warriors and held the loyalty of the men around him through a combination of generosity, fear, and personal strength. When the generosity dried up, or the fear faded, or the strength failed, the king's reign ended sometimes quietly, more often violently. The throne passed to a brother, a cousin, a man with a strong arm and enough supporters to take what the last man had lost. There were no coronations as we understand them, no written laws of succession, no ancient tradition that said this man and not that one should hold the crown. There was only power, and whoever could hold it. Into this already fractured world, in the summer of 793, came something that cracked the fractures open entirely. The monastery at Lindisfarne stood on a small tidal island off the northeast coast of England. It was one of the holiest places in the Christian world, a place where monks had spent generations copying scripture by hand, producing art of extraordinary beauty, building a house of learning in a landscape that offered almost nothing else. On a June morning, ships appeared on the water. The men who came off those ships did not negotiate. They did not demand tribute or send messengers ahead. They came with axes and the absolute certainty that nothing here could stop them. The monks had no weapons, no walls, no warning. Some were cut down where they stood. Some were dragged to the shore and thrown into the sea. The younger and stronger ones were taken to be sold, to serve, to spend the rest of their lives as property in a country they would never see. The treasures that the monastery had built over a century, the gold, the silver, the illuminated manuscripts, the reliquaries holding the bones of saints were loaded onto the ships and gone before the tide turned. What could not be carried was burned. The shock that spread through the Christian world at the news of Lindisfarne was not simply the shock of violence. Violence was ordinary. It was the shock of helplessness, the realization that holiness offered no protection, that sacred ground could be desecrated in an afternoon, that the world the church had been carefully building was more fragile than anyone had dared to admit. A scholar named Alcuin, writing from the court of the Frankish king Charlemagne, asked in a letter what this could mean, whether any church anywhere was safe, whether God had truly abandoned his people. He did not have an answer. No one did. But the Vikings who came to Lindisfarne were not the end of something. They were the beginning. Over the next century, Norse raiders returned to the English coasts again and again, probing further inland with each attack, learning the rivers, identifying the monasteries and towns worth hitting and the ones not worth the trouble. They discovered that the divided kingdoms of England could not cooperate long enough to stop them. One kingdom might repel a raid. Another, 50 miles away, would be hit the following year. There was no king powerful enough to command the whole island, no system for sharing information or sending aid. no structure that could respond to a threat that moved faster than messengers could ride. And then the raids became something different. The Vikings began to stay. They arrived not just with ships, but with families, with livestock, with the intention of farming the land they had been stealing from. The Danelaw, the great swathe of northern and eastern England that fell under Norse control through the middle of the 9th century, was not a temporary occupation. It was a settlement. The invaders were becoming neighbours. The neighbours were becoming part of the land. The land was still tearing itself apart. This is the world that made the British monarchy. Not a grand hall and a golden crown and a ceremony watched by nobles in fine clothes. A cold island in a dark century, cut apart by ambition and raided from the sea, full of people who wanted nothing more complicated than to survive, to bury their dead in their own ground, to wake up the next morning under a sky that still belonged to them. The crown would come, but it would be forged not in celebration, but in catastrophe. And the man who would begin the forging was already being born into a world that was running out of time. The winter of 878 AD was the worst of Alfred's life, and Alfred had not lived an easy life. He had been sick since childhood, a deep, grinding illness that came and went without warning, that bent him double with pain at moments when a king most needed to appear unbreakable. He had watched men die in battles he had fought. He had buried family. He had spent years holding a kingdom together with the kind of daily effort that never makes it into the songs. And still nothing had prepared him for this. Crouching in the reed beds of the Somerset marshes, cold to the bone, unknown, hunted, the King of Wessex in name only and in nothing else. Guthrum had struck in January, a season when armies were not supposed to move, when the land was frozen and the roads were mud, and the understood rules of warfare said that serious campaigning waited for spring. That was exactly why Guthrum chose it. His Viking force hit Chippenham, where Alfred was keeping his winter court, so suddenly and so hard that the king barely got out. His thanes, the warrior nobles who owed him loyalty and service, scattered. Some were killed, some surrendered to the Danes and submitted to their rule. The rest ran, each man saving himself, leaving Alfred with a handful of loyal followers and nowhere to go, except the one place an army on horseback could not easily follow, the swamp. The Somerset levels in winter are a world that barely feels like land at all. The ground gives under your feet. The mist sits so low in the mornings that you can lose a man standing 10 feet away. The water comes up through the soil in places and turns whole fields into shallow lakes that freeze at the edges and suck at the center. Alfred built a small, fortified camp on a rise of ground called Athelstan, a patch of firmer earth surrounded by marsh on every side, and he lived there through the hardest months of his reign, relying on the loyalty of a shrinking circle of men and the generosity of local farmers who had every reason to keep their heads down and no obvious reason to shelter a king who seemed to have already lost. The story that attached itself to this period, the one that has survived 1,000 years and shows no sign of leaving, is the story of the cakes. Alfred, sheltering in a peasant's cottage, was asked to watch the bread cooking over the fire while the woman of the house went to her other work. He sat by the fire and let his mind go somewhere else entirely, to Guthrum's army, to Wessex, to the question of whether anything could still be saved and the bread burned. The woman came back and scolded him with the particular sharpness reserved for people who cannot be trusted with simple tasks. She did not know he was the king. She spoke to him the way you speak to a man who has failed at something easy. Whether this moment happened exactly as told is a question historians have argued for centuries. What is not in question is what the story means. Alfred had been brought so far down that the ordinary rules of the world, the ones that said kings were above correction, above the small indignities of ordinary life, no longer applied to him. He was just a man who had let something burn. But the thing about Alfred is that the swamp did not break him. It clarified him. Illness had already taught him something that most kings never learned, that the body can be unreliable, that certainty is an illusion, that plans made in comfort can fall apart the moment real pressure arrives. He had grown up reading and thinking in a culture that mostly valued riding and fighting. He had been taken to Rome as a 4-year-old child, blessed by the Pope, given a glimpse of a world where power was built not just from armies but from ideas, from law, from the carefully organized systems that made a civilization hold together even when its individual pieces were weak. He carried all of that with him into the marsh. And in the marsh, he started planning. By spring, Alfred had built something back. He sent messengers through the countryside, men who moved quietly, who knew who could be trusted and who could not, who carried word that the king was alive and asking his people to remember what they owed each other. The response told him something important. The loyalty had not died with the winter. When he called his forces to Egbert's Stone in May of 878, men came from across Somerset, from Wiltshire, from Hampshire, farmers and warriors and freemen who had spent months waiting for exactly this summons, who had not surrendered their identity even when their king had disappeared. An army reassembled itself out of a scattered and frightened countryside because one man in a swamp had refused to give up. The Battle of Edington was not a long or complicated engagement by the standards of the age. Alfred's forces found Guthrum's Vikings and hit them with the concentrated force of men who had been waiting months for this moment. The Vikings broke. They fled to their fortified camp, and Alfred besieged them for 2 weeks until starvation forced them out. What followed was the part that surprised everyone. Alfred did not take Guthrum's head. He took his hand in baptism. The Viking warlord who had come so close to ending the kingdom of Wessex stood in a Christian church with Alfred as his godfather, received the name Athelstan, and signed a peace treaty that divided England into 2 legal territories, one ruled by Alfred's law, one left to the Danes. It was an act so politically sophisticated, so unexpected from a man who had every reason to want his enemy dead, that it has puzzled and impressed historians ever since. Alfred understood something that most rulers of his era did not. Killing Guthrum would produce another Guthrum. The Vikings had not come to England because of one man's ambition. They had come because England was rich and divided and worth taking. The only way to stop the raids was to make England harder to break, and the only way to do that was to build a system that did not depend on any single person's survival. So Alfred built. He laid out a network of fortified towns, the burhs positioned across his kingdom, with such geometric precision that no settlement was more than 20 miles from a defended position, meaning that no Viking raiding party could operate in Wessex without running into a wall of some kind. He reorganized his army so that half of his fighting men were always in the field, and the other half were home tending their farms, keeping the economy alive that paid for the defense. He commissioned the building of ships broader, more stable than the Norse longboats, designed to intercept raiders before they reached the shore. And then he did the thing that separated him most sharply from every king who had come before him. He picked up books. He learned Latin late in life, imperfectly, with great effort, and translated works of philosophy and history into Old English himself, works by Boethius and Gregory the Great, works that most people in England had no access to because they could not read Latin. He started a school for the children of nobles. He wrote a law code that drew from older Anglo-Saxon traditions but organized them into something coherent and consistent. He wrote a preface to one of his translations that is one of the most personal documents any medieval king ever left behind, a reflection on learning, on failure, on the duty of a ruler to give his people not just protection but understanding. He called himself King of the Anglo-Saxons. Not King of England, that name described something that did not yet exist. But the title was not modesty, it was precision. He was the king of a people, not just a territory. And by naming it that way, he was making an argument about what a kingdom was. Not a piece of land held by force, but a community bound by shared law, shared language, shared memory. When Alfred died in 899, the world he left behind was not England that would take another generation to complete, but it was the idea of England, the outline, the foundation, and it had been built by a sick man hiding in a marsh who chose, when everything was gone, to think rather than simply to survive. But foundations crack. The sons and grandsons who inherited Alfred's vision would discover that unifying a kingdom and holding it together were 2 entirely different problems, and that the men closest to the crown were often the most dangerous ones. In the room, Alfred left behind an idea. What his children inherited was the hard, unglamorous work of turning that idea into something real, of pushing across a broken landscape, town by town and fortress by fortress, until the whole of England was actually, not just theoretically, under one rule. It took 2 generations, and it nearly broke both of them. Alfred's son Edward, known to history as Edward the Elder, a title that says everything about how little personality history chose to remember him with, spent the years after his father's death doing exactly what the plan required. He moved north and east, building burhs ahead of his advance, establishing control over territory the Danes had held for decades. He was methodical, patient, and effective in ways that do not make for dramatic storytelling but that changed the map of England permanently. He worked in partnership with his sister, Athelstan, who had married the Lord of Mercia and, after his death, ruled that kingdom herself with a completeness of authority that no medieval source quite knew how to explain. The chroniclers called her the Lady of the Mercians. What they meant, even if they could not say it plainly, was that she was a queen in everything but name, a woman who made military decisions, commanded fortifications, negotiated with Welsh and Viking leaders on equal terms, and held a kingdom together through sheer force of competence, in an era when the idea of a woman doing any of those things had no established framework, no precedent, no language to contain it. Aethelflaed built fortresses at Derby, at Leicester, at Warwick, strategic positions chosen with the eye of a commander who understood the landscape as a weapon. She campaigned into Danish-held territory and took it. She formed alliances with the King of Scotland that her brother could use. When the Vikings of York opened secret negotiations to offer her their submission, recognizing that her power had reached the point where it was better to join it than resist it, she died before she could receive them, in June of 918, at a place called Tamworth. She was probably in her 40s. The work was almost finished. She did not live to see it completed. What happened next revealed something ugly about the world she had built within. Edward moved immediately to take control of Mercia himself, setting aside Aethelflaed's daughter Aelfwine, who had briefly been recognized as her mother's successor, and absorbing the kingdom directly into his own. There was no ceremony about it, no grief given time to settle. The girl was removed. The kingdom was taken. Whether Edward had planned this from the beginning, whether he had always intended to inherit what his sister built the moment she was no longer alive to defend it, is a question the sources leave unanswered. What they do not leave unanswered is the result. A woman who had spent her life building something was barely cold before a man claimed it. Edward's son Athelstan completed the final step in 927, receiving the formal submission of the kings of Scotland and Wales and the Norse rulers of Northumbria at a ceremony in the north of England that announced, as clearly as any medieval moment could announce anything, that the game was over. One man now controlled the whole island. Athelstan struck coins with the words Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain, and sent them circulating through a kingdom that had not existed as a unified entity a generation before. He was educated, politically sophisticated, connected by diplomatic marriage alliances to the royal houses of Europe. He hosted foreign scholars. He collected relics from across the Christian world with the intensity of a man who understood that sacred objects were also political ones, that the bones of saints were a form of authority, and that a king who possessed them possessed something that could not be argued with. He had no children. Historians have noted this without ever quite explaining it, whether by choice, circumstance, or some private arrangement we have no access to. Athelstan died in 939, leaving the throne to a younger brother rather than a son. Edmund was 23 years old when the crown passed to him, energetic and capable, a man who fought hard to hold together what his older brother had assembled. He did not have long. In 946, at a feast at Puckle Church, Edmund saw a man he recognized, an exiled thief named Leofa, someone who had been expelled from England and had no right to be in the king's hall eating the king's food. Edmund went to handle it himself, personally, the way a warrior king handled affronts to his hospitality. He was stabbed. He died from the wound. He was 25 years old. His children were too small to rule. His brother Edred took the throne and held it, sick for much of his reign, until he too died young. The pattern was becoming hard to ignore. Alfred had built a kingdom designed to outlast any individual, but the kingdom he built was still transmitted through individual bodies, individual lives that could end without warning, individual characters that could be strong or weak or corrupted by the particular pressures of power. Each reign that ended too soon reset the clock. Each new king had to re-establish authority, renegotiate loyalty, rebuild the relationships that held the whole structure upright. And every time the clock reset, the men standing closest to the throne, the nobles, the bishops, the powerful families who had learned to make themselves indispensable, had another opportunity to reshape the terms. The coronation of Edvig in 955 is remembered today mostly as a story that seems too strange to be taken seriously. The young king, 16 years old, newly crowned, disappeared from his own coronation feast. When the churchman Dunstan was sent to retrieve him, he found Eadwig in a private chamber with a noblewoman named Ethelgifu and her daughter Elgifu, the royal crown discarded on the floor beside them, as though it were a piece of clothing that had grown uncomfortable. Dunstan dragged the king back to his guests with a directness that bordered on physical force. Edwig never forgave him. Within months, Dunstan had been accused of misappropriating royal funds and driven into exile on the continent, his property seized, his career apparently over. But Dunstan did not stay exiled. Within 3 years, Eadwig's own kingdom had fractured. The nobles of Mercia and Northumbria refused to accept his rule and recognized his younger brother Edgar as their king instead. The island that Athelstan had unified was dividing again, and dividing along the exact lines that Dunstan and the church had influence over. When Eadwig died in 959, young and apparently without natural heirs, Edgar became king of a reunified England, and Dunstan came back elevated to Archbishop of Canterbury, the most powerful churchman in the kingdom, the man who would crown Edgar in a ceremony at Bath in 973, so elaborate and so theologically loaded that it became the template for every English coronation that followed, including the one performed in Westminster Abbey more than 1,000 years later. What the story of Edwig and Dunstan reveals is not simply a scandal or a personality conflict. It is the first clear demonstration of a dynamic that would define the English monarchy for the next several centuries, the contest between the crown and the institutions that surrounded it for control over what kingship actually meant. Dunstan and the church were not simply reacting to a misbehaving teenager, they were asserting a principle, that a king who could not be corrected was a king who had become dangerous, and that the church had both the right and the duty to correct him. Edwig's response that no institution had authority over a king was the older principle, the one Alfred himself had believed. Edgar's coronation, shaped entirely by Dunstan's vision of what a sacred king owed to God and to his people, was the newer one. The two ideas would collide, separate, collide again for the next 500 years. And beneath all of it, beneath the ceremony, the theology, the political maneuvering, a much simpler and more brutal crisis was building. The Vikings had not forgotten England, and the king who would face them next would make a decision so catastrophic, so irreversible, that it would hand the island to a foreign ruler within 15 years. There is a particular kind of king who is not evil in the way that word is usually understood. He does not enjoy cruelty. He does not scheme for the pleasure of scheming. He is simply afraid. Afraid in the deep, corrosive way that eats through a man's judgment over years, until the decisions he makes are no longer decisions at all, but the desperate thrashings of someone who has been drowning so long he has forgotten what dry land feels like. Ethelred II was that kind of king, and his fear killed thousands of people who had done nothing to deserve it. He came to the throne in 978 under a shadow that never left him. His older brother Edward, barely a teenager, king for just 3 years, had been murdered at Corfe Castle, almost certainly by members of Aethelred's own household, possibly with the knowledge of his mother. Ethelred was about 10 years old. He had not ordered it. He may not have known it was coming, but he inherited a throne soaked in his brother's blood, and the men who had spilled that blood were the same men who now surrounded him and told him what to do. He grew up inside a court that had already proven it would kill a king when it suited them. The lesson that taught him was not one that led to confidence. The name history gave him, Ethelred the Unready, is one of history's crueler jokes, because the Old English word it comes from, unread, does not mean unprepared. It means badly advised, or without counsel, or the man who could not find good guidance no matter how hard he looked. The name is also a wordplay on Aethelred itself, which means noble counsel. He was the noble counsel with no counsel, the king who should have been wise, surrounded by men who ensured he never was. Whether those men were simply self-interested, or whether Aethelred's own character pushed good advisers away and drew bad ones in, the result was the same. A reign of reactive decisions, of policies that created the crises they were meant to prevent, of a king who was always responding to the last disaster rather than thinking toward the next one. The Danegeld was the most visible symptom of this. When Viking fleets arrived off the English coast and demanded payment to leave, Aethelred paid. The first payment, in 991, was £10,000 of silver, an enormous sum raised by taxing every landowner in England. The Vikings took it and sailed away. They came back the following year. The payment went up. They came back again. By the end of Aethelred's reign, England had paid out somewhere between £100,000 and £200,000 of silver, in total a figure so vast it is almost incomprehensible in terms of what it cost ordinary people to produce it. Farmers who owed the tax had no choice but to pay. Those who could not pay lost their land. The silver left England and never came back, and in exchange England received nothing except a temporary quiet that everyone knew would not last. The intelligence that reached Aethelred in 1002 said that the Danes already settled inside England, not the raiders, but the men and women who had been living in the Danelaw for generations, who farmed English land and traded in English markets, and in many cases had converted to Christianity and raised English children, were in communication with the fleets outside, and were planning to rise up and kill the English nobility from within. Whether this intelligence was accurate, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated by advisers who stood to benefit from the elimination of Danish landholders and the seizure of their property, no source alive today can say with certainty. What is certain is that Aethelred believed it, or chose to act as though he believed it, and on the 13th of November, the feast day of St. Brice, he issued an order that went to every lord and sheriff and reeve in England, kill every Dane. The killing that followed was not a battle. It was not a military operation with commanders and objectives and the possibility of surrender. It was organized slaughter carried out by local men against their local neighbors, in streets and homes and fields they had shared for years. In some places, Danish residents had enough warning to run. In others, they had none. In Oxford, a group of Danes fled to the church of St. Fridswide and barricaded themselves inside, seeking the sanctuary that church law guaranteed to anyone who reached consecrated ground. The people outside did not honor it. They set the church on fire. The Danes inside burned with it, or came out choking into the blades waiting for them. A royal charter issued by Ethelred himself the following year acknowledges the burning of the church at Oxford and explains it away in language that is simultaneously an admission and an erasure, noting that the Danes had been killed like a sprouting crop of cockles, as though murder was a form of weeding. Among those killed on St. Brice's Day was a woman named Gunhilda. Her precise identity is debated. Some sources say she was the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, king of Denmark and Norway, and the most powerful Norse ruler alive. Others suggest the connection was less direct. What is not debated is that word of her death reached Sweyn Forkbeard, and that it joined the long list of reasons, political, strategic, personal, that he had already accumulated to want England humiliated and its king destroyed. Sweyn arrived with a fleet in 1003 and tore through the southwest. He came back in 1004 and devastated East Anglia. He returned in 1006 and rode his forces across the heart of England almost to the Thames, burning and taking what he wanted, demonstrating to every English earl watching that their king could not protect them. Each time, Aethelred paid. Each time, the fleet left. Each time, it came back larger. By 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard sailed into the Humber estuary with an army that was not raiding. It was conquering. The northern earls submitted to him almost immediately, recognizing which way the wind was blowing with the speed of men who had decided survival mattered more than loyalty to a king who had never adequately protected them. London held out, and Aethelred held out inside it, but the rest of England fell away from him like soil from a root that has finally been pulled free. Before the year was out, Ethelred had done something no English king had done since Alfred crouched in the Somerset marshes a century and a half before. He left. He sailed to Normandy, where his wife Emma's family held power, and he waited. Sweyn Forkbeard died in February 1014, abruptly, unexpectedly, 5 weeks after becoming the accepted ruler of England, and for a brief, strange moment, the whole sequence seemed to pause. The English nobility sent word to Aethelred in Normandy. They would take him back if he would promise to govern better than he had before. It was not quite a negotiation between equals, and it was not quite a demand. It was something newer than either a political transaction in which a king was told, clearly and without ceremony, that his return had conditions. Ethelred agreed to everything. He came back. He died in 1016 with his kingdom still contested. his son Edmund Ironside fighting Sweyn's son Knut for control of the country that Aethelred's single night of terror had irreparably weakened. Knut won. By the end of 1016, England was ruled by a Danish king, the son of the man whose sister Aethelred had ordered killed 14 years before. The full circle of it is almost too neat to be believed, and yet it is exactly what happened. The massacre meant to seal the kingdom had cracked it open. The fear that drove the order had summoned the very destruction it was trying to prevent. Thousands of people who had lived peacefully on English soil died on a November night so that a king who did not trust his own shadow could feel safe for one season. He did not feel safe for long, and England paid for his fear with a generation of blood. But conquest, it turned out, was only the beginning of England's reckoning. A new king from across the sea now sat on the throne, and what he did with it would force the island to ask a question it had never had to ask before. What does it mean to be ruled by someone who speaks a different language, prays in a different tradition, and owes you nothing at all? Edward the Confessor spent the last years of his reign essentially checking out. He had always been more monk than monarch, a man of prayer and ceremony who found the political machinery of kingship genuinely distasteful, who preferred the company of priests to the company of earls, and who poured his deepest energy not into ruling England, but into building the great Abbey Church at Westminster, which he would consecrate just days before he died and never truly see finished. He left behind no children, no designated heir that anyone could agree on, and a throne that had been sitting under a slowly gathering storm for years. When he died on the 5th of January 1066, the storm broke. 3 men believed the crown was theirs. The first, and the quickest, was Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, son of the most powerful noble family in England, a man who had effectively been running the kingdom while Edward devoted himself to his devotions. Harold claimed that Edward had whispered his name as heir in his final moments. The claim was convenient and unprovable, and Harold knew that every hour he did not act on it was an hour for someone else to act first. He was crowned king on January 6, the day after Edward's burial, the fastest coronation in English history, a ceremony stripped of its usual deliberation because deliberation was a luxury Harold could not afford. The haste itself told the story. This was not a man secure in his right. This was a man racing against a clock only he could fully hear. The second claimant needed no such haste because he was not yet in England. Harald Hardrada. Harold, the hard ruler of Norway, had spent his life accumulating a reputation for violence that stretched from the frozen fjords of Scandinavia to the courts of Constantinople, where he had served as a commander in the Byzantine Emperor's elite Varangian Guard. He had fought in Sicily and Bulgaria and along the rivers of Russia. He had survived campaigns that killed stronger men and come home richer and more dangerous each time. His claim to the English throne rested on a treaty made between 2 dead Scandinavian kings, decades before a legal argument that required a certain generosity of interpretation. But Harald Hardrada was not a man who made arguments. He made invasions. He spent the early months of 1066 building a fleet. The third man was the most dangerous of the 3, and not because of his army. William, Duke of Normandy, was dangerous because of his mind. He was the illegitimate son of a duke and a tanner's daughter, raised in a court that had tried to kill him multiple times before he was 20, hardened by a childhood in which trust was something only fools offered freely. He had ruled Normandy since he was a child, and had spent his adult life making the duchy into one of the most effectively governed territories in Europe. His claim to the English throne was genealogical. He was a first cousin once removed of Edward the Confessor, which in the hierarchy of medieval inheritance was thin enough to be ignored by anyone who wanted to ignore it. But William had something better than blood. He had a story. The story was this. Several years earlier, Harold Godwinson had been caught in a storm off the Normandy coast and taken captive by a local lord. William had secured his release and treated him as an honoured guest. During this visit, William said, Harold had sworn a solemn oath on the bones of Normandy's most sacred saints to support William's claim to the English throne when Edward died. The relics had been placed beneath a cloth, concealed from Harold's sight until after he had laid his hands on them and spoken the words, a detail that made the oath not just binding but a trap, a moment of sacred commitment made in conditions Harold could not have fully understood. Whether this happened exactly as William described, whether Harold understood what he was swearing, whether the relics were really there, or were produced afterward for effect, no witness alive today can confirm. What William could confirm was the Pope's verdict. He appealed to Rome, made his case, and the Pope declared him the rightful King of England and Harold a perjurer and a usurper. William's invasion was not a conquest. It was a crusade. The year moved with a speed that left everyone scrambling. In September, Harold Hardrada's fleet entered the Humber estuary in the north and began burning through Yorkshire with the practiced ease of a man who had been making war his whole life. Harold Godwinson had been waiting on the south coast for William, watching the channel with the nervous attention of a man who knew his real enemy was not yet in the country. When word came of the northern invasion, he turned his entire force around and marched them the length of England, roughly 300 miles, in roughly 4 days. The pace was extraordinary, punishing, the kind of march that strips men of everything except the determination to keep moving. At Stamford Bridge, on September 25, they hit Hardrada's forces hard and fast and completely, killing the Norse warlord and routing his army in a battle so one-sided, it effectively ended the Viking age of English raiding in a single afternoon. 3 days later, William landed at Pevensey on the southern coast. Harold received the news while his army was still at Stamford Bridge, still burying its dead, still binding its wounds. The argument among his advisers was fierce, and the historical debate it started has never fully ended. Wait, rest, rebuild the force, give the men who had just marched 300 miles and fought a major battle the time to recover, or move immediately before William could dig in, before the Norman army could range freely through the south of England, burning villages and demonstrating to the English nobility that their king was too slow to protect them. Harold chose speed. He turned his exhausted army south and marched them back the way they had come. The battle at Hastings on the 14th of October 1066 lasted longer than almost any medieval engagement on record, from morning until the light began to fail in the evening, hours of sustained combat that ground both sides down through sheer attrition. Harold's English infantry held a ridge and formed a shield wall that the Norman cavalry broke itself against repeatedly through the morning and into the afternoon. The wall did not shatter the way walls usually did. It held and went on holding, and for stretches of the afternoon it seemed possible that Harold might simply outlast the attack through pure defensive endurance. Then the Normans did something that the English either did not recognize or could not resist. They retreated. Whether the retreat was real panic or deliberate bait, sections of the English line broke formation and gave chase. When they did, the Norman cavalry wheeled and cut them apart. The wall that had held all day came apart in pieces, and by the time the sun was going down, Harold Godwinson was dead, killed in the final press of the fighting, by means that the Bayeux tapestry suggests but does not make certain. William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066, in the newly consecrated Westminster Abbey, using the same building Edward the Confessor had spent his reign constructing as a monument to his own piety, now serving as the stage for the coronation of the man who had made Edward's lack of an heir into a weapon. The ceremony was so tense that when the assembled crowd shouted their acclamation, William's Norman guards outside heard only a roar and assumed it was an uprising. They set fire to the surrounding buildings. The new king was crowned in a burning city, sweating and shaking at the altar, in a ceremony that began in ceremony and ended in chaos. It was an omen that the years ahead would justify entirely. What William did to England after the conquest was not occupation in the way that word is usually understood. It was replacement. The English earls who had survived Hastings were stripped of their lands within years, their estates handed to Norman lords who did not speak their language and owed them nothing. New castles went up across the country, the White Tower in London, the fortresses at Durham and Colchester, built not to defend England from outside attack, but to remind the English people inside it that they had been conquered and that the men who held them down were not leaving. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, was the final expression of this new order, a complete census of every hide of land, every mill, every fish pond, every villager in England, recorded so that the king knew exactly what he owned and exactly what every man in his kingdom owed him. No English king had ever known his kingdom so completely. No English king had ever needed to. The language fracture that the conquest created ran through English life for 300 years. Norman French was the tongue of law, of courts, of power, of the dinner tables where decisions were made. Old English was what servants spoke, what farmers argued in, what mothers used to comfort their children in the dark. But the two languages were living in the same houses, working the same fields, sleeping under the same roofs, and slowly the way all living things change when they cannot be kept apart, they merged. The English we speak today carries both of them. The word ask is Anglo-Saxon. The word question is Norman French. The word begin is Anglo-Saxon. The word commence is Norman French. Cow is the Anglo-Saxon animal in the field. Beef is the Norman French meat on the table. We still eat the conquest every time we sit down to dinner. We still speak the aftermath of 1 October Day in 1066 every time we open our mouths. England had survived invasion before. It had absorbed the Anglo-Saxons, absorbed the Danes, and now it would absorb the Normans. But survival and peace are not the same thing. The new kings the conquest produced were harder, more ambitious, and more willing to reach into sacred ground than anything England had yet seen, and the Church was about to discover exactly what that meant. Henry II was the kind of king England had not seen in a long time, and would not see again for longer still, a man of almost supernatural energy, who could ride from one end of his vast territories to the other faster than his own messengers, who held court while walking, because sitting still felt to him like a kind of dying, who rebuilt the machinery of English governance from the wreckage left by 2 decades of civil war, with the focused intensity of a man who understood that civilization was not a given, but a daily construction. He reformed the courts. He standardized the law. He brought royal justice to parts of England where local lords had been law unto themselves for a generation. He was not a good man in the private sense. He was faithless, explosive, and capable of cruelty when crossed, but he was an exceptional king, and he knew it, and the one thing he wanted above almost everything else was a church that answered to the same law as everyone else. Thomas Becket was supposed to be the instrument of that ambition. The two men had been close in a way that medieval friendship between a king and a subject rarely managed genuinely close, not merely politically aligned. Becket was Henry's chancellor, the second most powerful man in England, a man who dressed in finer clothes than most nobles and kept a more lavish table than most bishops, and who seemed, to everyone watching, to be exactly the kind of worldly, pragmatic, thoroughly royal servant that Henry needed at his side. They hunted together. They argued and laughed together. There are accounts of the king and his chancellor playing together in the streets of London like men who had simply forgotten, for an afternoon, what they were. When Henry decided to place his most trusted man inside the church's most powerful English office, it seemed like the political masterstroke of a generation. It was the worst decision he ever made. What happened inside Thomas Becket when he became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162 is one of the genuine mysteries of medieval history, not because the facts are hidden, but because the inner life of a 12th century churchman is not something any modern analysis can fully reach. He resigned the chancellorship immediately, which shocked Henry and should have warned him. He began living with an austerity that bordered on theatre, wearing a hair shirt beneath his archbishop's robes, keeping fasts that weakened him visibly, giving away money he had once spent on spectacle. Whether this was sincere religious transformation, the discovery of a vocation he had suppressed while serving the king, political calculation dressed in spiritual clothing, or simply the act of a man who had decided that being Henry's creature was a role, he was finished playing. All of these explanations have been offered, and none of them is complete. What is complete is the result. Becket became the most implacable defender of church independence that Henry had ever faced, and he had specifically placed Becket there to prevent exactly that. The 8 years that followed were a long, grinding public humiliation for a king who was not built for humiliation. Henry pushed the Constitutions of Clarendon in 1164, a legal document that tried to define the limits of church authority in England and bring clergy accused of crimes under royal courts rather than church ones. Becket refused to accept them. The argument drove him into exile in France, where he spent 6 years being diplomatically supported by the French king and the Pope in a way that enraged Henry and prevented him from simply crushing the opposition by force. Letters went back and forth across the Channel, letters of complaint, letters of accusation, letters that accused each man of bad faith and betrayal and ungodliness, a paper war fought across years by 2 men who had once been inseparable and now could not speak without producing a diplomatic incident. A partial reconciliation was eventually reached in 1170, enough to allow Becket to return to England. He stepped off the boat at Sandwich in December and almost immediately proved that nothing had actually been resolved by excommunicating the bishops who had crowned Henry's son during his absence, a direct assertion that the Archbishop of Canterbury's authority over English religious affairs had not been diminished by 6 years of exile or by a single word of the constitutions of Clarendon. Henry was in Normandy when he heard what Becket had done. The exact words he spoke have been recorded in 4 different versions by 4 different witnesses, and none of them agree precisely, but they agree on the shape and the fury of it, the sense of a man who had been pushed past endurance by someone he had trusted and elevated, and who was now using that elevation as a weapon against him. 4 of his knights heard the words as a commission. They crossed the Channel, rode to Canterbury, and arrived at the cathedral on the evening of the 29th of December 1170, armed and intent. They found Becket at vespers, surrounded by monks who urged him to flee or bar the doors. He refused. He told them that he had not come back to England to run again. He walked toward the altar. What the 4 knights did to Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral that evening was not an execution. It was a dismemberment. They struck him repeatedly, even as he fell, with a violence that went far beyond what killing required. One blow so hard, it broke the sword against the stone floor and scattered pieces of his skull across the cathedral pavement. His brain matter pooled on the ground of the holiest church in England. A knight named Hugh de Morville stood guard at the door while it happened, to prevent interference. When it was over, the men who had done it left without taking anything, without attempting to conceal what had occurred, apparently without fully understanding what they had just made. The reaction that spread from Canterbury across England and then across Europe in the days and weeks that followed was not simply grief or outrage. It was something closer to awe at the scale of the miscalculation, the sense that something enormous and irreversible had been set in motion. Miracles were reported at Becket's tomb almost immediately, with the speed that suggests a population that had been waiting for a martyr and recognized one the moment it had one. Within 2 years, Pope Alexander III had declared Becket a saint. Within a decade, his shrine at Canterbury had become one of the most visited pilgrimage sites in the Christian world, drawing believers from across Europe who came to kneel at the spot where the king's rage had become the church's greatest weapon. Henry did penance in 1174, walking barefoot through the streets of Canterbury in a hair shirt, kneeling at Becket's tomb, allowing the monks of the cathedral to flog him across the back while he knelt, and did not resist. It was the most complete public humiliation of a reigning English monarch in the medieval period, a scene so extraordinary that contemporaries struggled to find language adequate to it. He said the words that were required. He performed the gestures that were demanded. And when he stood up and walked out of Canterbury Cathedral, he was a different king than he had been when he walked in, not diminished in his power, exactly, but marked, permanently, by the proof that there were limits to what even the most capable ruler could do, and that the man he had killed had become, in death, precisely the immovable obstacle he had been unable to manage in life. Henry's empire would not survive him intact. His sons would tear it apart, not through foreign invasion, but through the oldest of all royal diseases, the refusal of sons to wait for what their father had, and in the wreckage of that family war, the barons watching from the edges would find their moment to reach for something no one had ever managed to put in writing before. To understand what happened at Runnymede in June of 1215, you first have to understand what John had done to get there, and what John had done was essentially spend 16 years proving, one act at a time, that he was a man who could not be trusted with the power he held. This is not a simple verdict. John was intelligent, administratively capable, and in some respects a more hands-on king than his famous brother Richard, who spent the bulk of his reign crusading abroad and treating England largely as a treasury to be raided for funds. John was present. He worked. He paid attention to the details of governance in ways that Richard never bothered with, but he was also possessed of a paranoia so deep and a vindictiveness so consistent that his intelligence became a weapon he turned on the very people he needed most. The losses in France came first, and defined everything that followed. The territories in Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, lands the English crown had held since the conquest. Lands that gave the Norman and Angevin kings their wealth, their military base, and their identity as rulers of something larger than a cold island off the European coast, were lost to the French King Philip II in a military campaign between 1202 and 1204 that ended with John retreating to England, while his continental empire collapsed around him. He had not fought well. He had not chosen well. He had abandoned a nephew named Arthur, who had a claim to his throne, and who disappeared into John's custody in 1203 and was never seen again, almost certainly murdered on John's orders or by his hand, a killing so politically toxic that it drove several key Norman barons to defect to the French side rather than continue serving a man capable of it. The loss of Normandy was not just a military defeat, it was a statement about what kind of king John was, and the barons who had estates on both sides of the Channel understood the statement completely. What followed at home was a king trying to recover what he had lost abroad by squeezing the people beneath him harder than they had ever been squeezed. The feudal system of medieval England was built on a network of obligations. The barons owed the king military service and certain payments, and the king in return owed them a relationship that had rules, that had limits, that did not simply take from them without cause or warning whenever it suited him. John ignored the rules. He charged relief payments, the fees a baron's heir paid to inherit his father's lands at rates so far above the customary amounts that they functioned as extortion by another name. He seized the lands of barons who fell out of favor without the legal process that custom required. He took the sons and daughters of noble families as hostages to guarantee the loyalty of their parents, holding children in conditions that ranged from comfortable to genuinely dangerous, depending on how cooperative their families were being. He sold royal justice, literally charged money for access to the courts that were supposed to deliver it equally. He taxed the church, and then taxed it again when the first taxation produced resistance, triggering a 6-year standoff with Pope Innocent III that resulted in the entirety of England being placed under an interdict, meaning that the church stopped performing sacraments across the whole country, and ordinary people could not be baptized, married in church, or given last rites for 6 years because their king would not yield. By 1214, the final attempt to retake the French territories had failed at the Battle of Bouvines, and the barons who had funded the campaign through yet another round of extraordinary taxation had nothing to show for their money, except the confirmation that their king was incapable of the military success that might have justified what he asked of them. The rebellion that gathered through the winter of 1214 and 1215 was not impulsive. It was the result of years of accumulated grievance, carefully organized by men who understood that their window was open because John was weaker than he had ever been, and that if they did not act now, they might not get another chance. In May of 1215, the rebel barons formally renounced their homage to the king and marched on London. The city opened its gates. London was not supposed to do that. London doing that meant John had almost nothing left. The negotiations at Runnymede, on a flat meadow beside the Thames between Windsor and Staines, lasted several days in mid-June. The document that emerged from them, 63 clauses hammered out between a king who had no choice and barons who were not entirely certain what they wanted beyond the immediate end of specific abuses, was largely concerned with the particular complaints of the particular men who had written it. It addressed feudal relief payments and forest laws, and the treatment of widows, and the rights of merchants, and the behavior of royal officials in ways that mattered enormously to the noble families at the table, and were essentially irrelevant to the vast majority of people living in England at the Sixpenord time. It was not a democratic document. It was not intended to be. The men who wrote it were not philosophers of liberty. They were landowners who wanted their property rights protected and their customary privileges restored. But buried in the middle of the document was Clause 39, and Clause 39 said something that the men writing it may not have fully understood they were saying. No free man shall be seized, imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, exiled, or in any way destroyed, nor shall we proceed against him or send others to proceed against him, except by the lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land. In a document full of clauses about inheritance fees and fishing weirs, this one reached past all of that towards something larger, the idea that the king himself was bound by law, that the law existed independently of the king's will, that a man's rights could not simply be erased by royal command. It was not a revolutionary statement in the way that the French Revolution would later make revolutionary statements. It was a conservative one, an appeal to existing custom and tradition. But the principle it contained was a seed, and seeds do not ask permission before they grow. John placed his seal on the document on June 15 and began working to undo it before the ink was dry. His letter to the Pope was probably written before the ceremony at Runnymede was over. Innocent III, who had his own reasons for wanting a strong English king rather than a kingdom controlled by rebel barons, declared Magna Carta null and void within 2 months, calling it shameful, demeaning, illegal, and unjust. Civil war resumed. John died in October 1216. In the middle of it, from an illness that swept through him rapidly enough that contemporaries suspected poison and modern historians lean toward dysentery. A king, undone in the end, not by rebellion or battle, but by his own failing body, leaving behind a 9-year-old son, a country at war, and a document that everyone had just agreed was worthless. The regents who governed for the boy King Henry III reissued Magna Carta in 1216 to win baronial support for the regime stripped of its most threatening clauses, softened, made more manageable. They reissued it again in 1217, and again in 1225, when Henry III confirmed it in his own name. Each reissue was a transaction. The king got cooperation, the barons got the charter reaffirmed. Over decades, the reissuing became a tradition, and the tradition became law, and the law became foundational. By the end of the 13th century, Magna Carta was not just a piece of paper. It was a reference point, the document that English lawyers and parliaments and rebels and reformers reached for whenever they needed to argue that the king had gone too far. It became, over centuries, something that none of the men at Runnymede would have recognized. A symbol of the idea that power has limits, that rulers answer to something larger than themselves, that the law belongs to everyone it governs. When the American founders wrote the Fifth Amendment, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, they were paraphrasing. Consciously, words first scratched into Latin parchment in a meadow in England 8 centuries before. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was assembled in the aftermath of the Second World War, its architects had claws 39 inches their minds. Every court in the democratic world that rules a government cannot simply lock someone away without charge or trial is, at some level, the long echo of a moment when a group of angry barons forced a bad king to a table and produced, almost by accident, the most consequential legal sentence in the history of the English language. The barons of 1215 had fought to restrain a king. Within 2 centuries, England would find itself fighting a war so long and so devastating that it would take the vision of a single teenage girl and her willingness to die for it to break the deadlock and send the English home. A war that lasts 116 years is not really a war in any sense the word usually carries. It is a condition, a state of being in which entire generations are born into conflict, grow old inside it, and die before it ends, passing the fighting down to their children the way other generations pass down land or debt. The 100 Years' War between England and France was that kind of thing. It was not one sustained campaign, but a series of conflicts separated by truces that everyone knew were temporary, each peace treaty really just an agreement to stop killing for a while until one side or the other felt strong enough to resume. By the time it ended in 1453, no one alive in either country could remember a world before it. It had become the background of life itself. The argument that started it was, on the surface, a legal one. When the French King Charles IV died in 1328 without a male heir, the question of who should inherit the French throne opened up in ways the French nobility found deeply uncomfortable. Edward III of England had a claim through his mother Isabella, who was Charles's sister. The French disagreed, invoking a legal tradition called Salic law that excluded inheritance through the female line. They crowned their own candidate, Philip VI, and told Edward that his claim was void. Edward accepted this for a decade, more or less, and then in 1337, after years of diplomatic friction, French support for the Scots against England, and disputes over the English-held territory of Gascony, he stopped accepting it. He declared himself the rightful King of France. The war began. The early decades produced a series of English victories so complete and so unexpected that they rewrote European assumptions about how battles were fought and who won them. At Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen, common men, not knights, armed with 6-foot bows of yew that took years to master and could send an arrow through plate armor at 200 yards, destroyed a French force made up of the most expensively equipped cavalry in Europe. The French charged the English lines again and again, and were cut down each time, their war horses screaming, their armour no protection at all against the sheer volume of arrows falling like rain. The crossbowmen the French had hired from Genoa ran. The French knights, furious at being outpaced by their own mercenaries, rode through them. The English longbowmen kept shooting. When the day ended, the French had lost somewhere between 1,500 and 4,000 men of noble blood, including 11 princes and 81 lords. The English losses were minimal. It was not just a battle. It was a demonstration that the age of the armoured knight as the decisive unit of medieval warfare was ending. Agincourt in 1415 made that demonstration permanent in the imagination of the English-speaking world. Henry V had invaded France with a force that was exhausted, ill, and outnumbered by a margin that even his most loyal commanders found alarming estimates vary, but the English were almost certainly outnumbered by at least 4-1 and possibly 6-1. Henry chose his ground on a narrow field flanked by forest, which compressed the French advance and turned their numerical advantage into a liability. The English longbowmen planted sharpened stakes before them and waited. The French cavalry charged into arrow fire and the stakes and the mud of a recently ploughed field, and the momentum that numbers were supposed to provide collapsed into a trapped and slaughtering press of men and horses, unable to move forward or back. Henry V won the most famous battle of the 100 Years' War in a single afternoon, and when the day was done, he had the English poets and chroniclers who had witnessed it write it down in terms that have barely changed in 600 years. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 seemed to settle everything. The French king, Charles VI, mentally ill, intermittently incapacitated, a man who had spent years of his reign unable to recognize his own family, acknowledged Henry V as his heir and the future king of a united Anglo-French crown. Henry married Charles's daughter, Catherine. The dual monarchy that English kings had been reaching toward for 3 generations appeared, finally, to be within grasp. And then Henry V died. He was 35 years old. The siege of Meaux had given him dysentery, the same disease that had killed so many medieval military campaigns, and within weeks he was gone, leaving behind a 9-month-old son, a regency council, and an Anglo-French empire that required a functioning adult king to hold it together, and now had none. The French nobility, who had never fully accepted the Treaty of Troyes and had spent the years since its signing supporting the disinherited French Prince Charles as the true heir, saw their opportunity and began pushing back methodically. The English held Paris and the north. The French held the south and the centre. Neither side could land a decisive blow. The war ground on through the 1420s in the way that wars grind on when neither side has the strength to end it, siege by siege, village by village, year after exhausting year. And then, in 1428, the English laid siege to Orléans, a city on the Loire that guarded the approach to the French held south. If Orléans fell, the war was effectively over. The French king would have nowhere left to retreat to. Everything hung on that city's walls. Into this military and political crisis, in early 1429, walked a girl named Joan. She was from Domremy, a small village in the Duchy of Bar in eastern France, the daughter of a farmer, 17 years old and entirely without military experience, political connection, or any conventional qualification for the role she was claiming. She said, and had been saying for roughly 3 years, to anyone who would listen, to local lords, and eventually to royal emissaries, that she had heard the voices of saints telling her that God had chosen her specifically to drive the English from France and to stand at the side of the uncrowned Prince Charles while he was anointed king at Reims. She described the voices in detail. She said she had seen light accompanying them. She was examined by church authorities who found no evidence of heresy or madness. She was examined by women of the court who confirmed she was a virgin, which mattered, in the theological framework of the time, as a kind of proof of character. The prince was desperate enough to give her a horse, armour, a banner, and a small retinue of soldiers. He did it, one imagines, with the calculations of a man who had run out of better options. What Joan of Arc did between May and July of 1429 has no clean military explanation. She arrived at Orléans with a relief force, and the city's defenders, electrified by her presence and by what she represented, fought with a ferocity they had not shown in months. The siege that the English had been tightening for 7 months was broken in 9 days. Joan was wounded by an arrow during the fighting and returned to the field the same day. A series of battles followed in rapid succession: Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, Beaugency, Patay, each one an English defeat, the momentum of the war reversing itself at a speed that no strategic analysis adequately accounts for. In July of 1429, she stood beside Charles VII as he was crowned King of France in the cathedral at Reims, the ceremony she had promised him, the symbol that told both nations that the tide had changed. She had been in the field for less than 3 months. She had not lost a battle. She was captured by Burgundian troops in May of 1430 near Compiègne, sold to the English for 10,000 livres, and put on trial in Rouen, a trial conducted by French churchmen working under English authority, a theological proceeding designed from its opening session to produce a single verdict. The charges were heresy and cross-dressing the male clothing she had worn throughout her campaigns, which the court argued was an offence against natural and divine order. She defended herself with an intelligence and a composure that repeatedly surprised the men questioning her, holding her position through months of interrogation, recanting briefly under pressure, and then withdrawing her recantation. On the 30th of May, 1431, she was tied to a stake in the marketplace of Rouen and burned. She was 19 years old. An English soldier, watching from the crowd, said afterward that they had burned a saint. He was not the only one who thought so. The war continued for another 22 years, but it continued in the direction Joan had pointed. The English never recovered the initiative. Paris fell to the French in 1436. Province by province, the territories that English kings had fought and taxed and died for across 4 generations were lost. By 1453, England held only Calais of all its French possessions, a single port town, a remnant, the last physical evidence of an imperial ambition that had consumed a century of blood and silver and finally come to nothing. The kings who came after Henry V would spend the rest of the century fighting not for France but simply to hold England itself, as the humiliation of losing the war turned inward and tore the English nobility apart in the conflict history would call the Wars of the Roses. France had been lost. But the man who would define the next crisis for the English monarchy was not interested in France at all. He wanted something closer, something more personal, a marriage the Pope would not bless, and a church he would simply rebuild from the foundations up, if that was what it took to get it. There is a version of Henry VIII that history has almost worn smooth through overuse: the fat king with the 6 wives, the cartoon tyrant with the turkey leg, the man so defined by his excesses that the actual shape of what he did has been obscured beneath the legend of how he looked doing it. Strip that away, and what remains is something stranger and more genuinely frightening. A man of real intelligence and real learning, who spent the first half of his reign as one of the most admired monarchs in Europe, and the second half dismantling every institution that stood between his will and its fulfillment, one execution at a time, until the country he ruled had been remade in ways that would send ripples through the next 5 centuries of English and world history. The divorce is where most people start the story. But the story really begins with who Henry was before the divorce made him into someone else entirely. He came to the throne in 1509 at the age of 17, and the court that received him exhaled with relief. His father, Henry VII, had been careful, suspicious, and tight with money in ways that his nobles found oppressive and his subjects found exhausting. The new king was the opposite in almost every direction: tall, broad-shouldered, visibly healthy in an age that prized physical vitality as a sign of divine favor, educated in the Renaissance tradition that valued music and languages and theology alongside horsemanship and combat. He spoke Latin, French, and some Spanish. He composed songs, at least 2 of which are still performed today. He had read enough theology to hold his own in debate with trained churchmen, and he had a genuine fascination with the religious questions that were beginning to tear Europe apart, a fascination so orthodox, at this early stage, that Pope Leo X gave him the title Defender of the Faith in 1521 for writing a pamphlet attacking Martin Luther. That title, in one of history's more complete ironies, is still carried by the British monarch today. Catherine of Aragon had been queen since the beginning. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, a woman of considerable intelligence and genuine courage who had served as regent of England while Henry was away on campaign and done it competently enough to earn genuine respect. She had been married to Henry's older brother Arthur before Arthur died young, which created the theological complication that would eventually destroy her, the question of whether a man could legitimately marry his brother's widow, and whether the papal dispensation that had permitted the marriage in the first place was valid or had been improperly granted. Catherine maintained until her death that her first marriage had never been consummated, that she had come to Henry as a virgin, and that therefore no impediment had ever existed. Henry, by the late 1520s, had chosen to believe otherwise, with the urgency of a man who needed a legal argument badly enough to construct one. The urgency was succession. Of all the children Catherine had carried, and she had been pregnant at least 6 times, only one had survived infancy. Mary, born in 1516, healthy and sharp-minded and entirely female, in a Europe where the idea of a queen regnant was regarded at best as an experiment and at worst as an invitation to chaos, the absence of a male heir was not a personal disappointment. It was a political crisis. Henry had watched his own dynasty come to the throne through a civil war that had cost England decades of stability. He had no intention of leaving the same instability behind him, and he had, by the late 1520s, become deeply attached to a young woman of the court named Anne Boleyn, dark-eyed, sharp-tongued, French-educated, unwilling to become a royal mistress and clever enough to understand that the only position that made her safe was the one currently occupied by Catherine. The obstacle was the Pope, and the obstacle turned out to be immovable in ways that Henry had not fully anticipated. Pope Clement VII was in no position to grant the annulment Henry wanted, and the reason was not primarily theological. It was military. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who in 1527 had sent his troops into Rome in a rampage known as the Sack of Rome that left the Pope a virtual prisoner of imperial power. Clement could not afford to insult Charles by annulling his aunt's marriage to the English king, no matter how theologically creative the argument in favor of doing so became. Henry's representative in Rome, Cardinal Wolsey, spent years trying to find a path through this political wall and failed. Henry destroyed him for it stripped of his offices, arrested for treason, dead on the road to his own trial in 1530, spared the execution only by the convenience of a sudden illness. The message was the one Henry always sent when someone failed him. There was no such thing as loyal service that was not also successful service. The solution Henry and his new advisers, particularly a lawyer of extraordinary political intelligence named Thomas Cromwell, arrived at, was so radical that it is still difficult to absorb fully 6 centuries later. If the Pope would not grant the annulment, England would simply stop recognizing the Pope's authority. The break from Rome was not a single dramatic moment, but a sequence of parliamentary acts passed between 1532 and 1534, each one cutting another thread of the rope that connected England to the Catholic Church. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 was the final and decisive cut. Henry VIII was declared the supreme head of the Church of England, with full authority over all matters of doctrine, appointments, and discipline. 1,000 years of papal jurisdiction over English religious life was ended by a vote in Parliament. The Pope's response excommunicating Henry, declaring England formally separated from Rome, changed nothing on the ground in England, because Henry had already made the ground entirely his own. The dissolution of the monasteries that followed between 1536 and 1541 was perhaps the single most consequential act of domestic transformation in English history between the Norman Conquest and the Industrial Revolution. There were roughly 800 monastic houses in England at the time. Benedictine abbeys, Franciscan friaries, Cistercian monasteries, convents of every order holding perhaps a quarter of all the cultivated land in the country, accumulated over centuries of donation, bequest, and purchase. They housed monks, nuns, and lay brothers. They ran hospitals and schools. They preserved manuscripts. They fed the local poor. They were, in many communities, the only institution between ordinary people and starvation in a bad year. Henry dissolved them all. The land was sold, mostly to the gentry and nobility who supported the break from Rome and who were now bound to that break by the financial interest of keeping what they had bought. The buildings were stripped of their lead and their timber. Some were converted to private houses. Most were simply left to fall. The ruins of the great English abbeys Fountains, Rievaulx, Tintern are what they are today because Henry VIII decided their wealth was more useful to him than their function. The executions were the part that made the cost of descent unmistakably clear. Thomas More had been Henry's chancellor, his intellectual companion, the man whose reputation as the finest mind in Europe gave Henry's court a prestige that no amount of spectacle alone could produce. More refused to swear the oath acknowledging Henry's supremacy over the church. He did not publicly condemn the break from Rome. He stayed silent, calculating that silence was not the same as opposition. The court decided otherwise. He was convicted of treason on the testimony of a witness whose reliability was immediately questioned by everyone except the judges, and beheaded on Tower Hill in July 1535. Bishop John Fisher, elderly and frail and the most respected churchman in England, died the same way, the same month. The two executions sent a message that More's silence had been trying to avoid making necessary. It did not matter whether you spoke against Henry's new order. What mattered was whether you were willing to affirm it completely, publicly, and without reservation. Half loyalty was the same as treason. The 6 wives are the part of the story that popular history has always found easiest to tell, and they deserve their place in it, not as a parade of victims but as the clearest evidence of what Henry had become by the time the break from Rome had made him answerable to no one above himself. Catherine of Aragon he wore down slowly, separating her from her daughter, isolating her in damp houses, stripping her of her title and her household, refusing to the end to acknowledge that she had ever been his queen. Anne Boleyn he accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, almost certainly on charges manufactured by Cromwell, and had her beheaded in May 1536, 19 days before he married Jane Seymour. Jane died, giving birth to the son Henry had spent 27 years and 2 broken marriages waiting for. Anne of Cleves he married for diplomatic reasons, disliked on sight, and divorced within 6 months, describing her in terms so unflattering that his ambassadors who had negotiated the match spent the rest of the year in fear for their lives. Catherine Howard was young, likely a teenager when Henry married her, and executed for alleged adultery in 1542 with a speed that suggests the charges were at least partly real. Catherine Parr survived him by outliving him, nursing a sick and increasingly paranoid old man through his final years, narrowly avoiding arrest on religious grounds in the months before he died. Henry VIII died in January 1547, bloated, ulcerated, in constant pain from a leg wound that had never healed and a body that had been magnificent at 17 and was wreckage at 55. He left behind 3 children, who would between them enact 3 entirely different visions of what England's religious identity should be. His 9-year-old son Edward, who would reign briefly under Protestant regents, his daughter Mary, who would restore Catholicism with a ferocity that earned her the name Bloody Mary, and his daughter Elizabeth, who would eventually navigate between the two with a political genius that surpassed even her father's. The Church of England that Henry created out of vanity and need, and the cold calculation of a man who had decided that God's representative on earth was answerable to the King of England, that church still exists. It has 40 million members in England alone. Its cathedrals are among the most visited buildings in the world. Its monarch is still, by law, its supreme governor. All of it began with a man who wanted a divorce and found the word no intolerable. Henry's children would spend their reigns fighting over the soul of the church he had made. But a far older and more fundamental question was still building in the background, not what England believed, but who, in the end, held the power to decide. That question had a date, and it was coming. The argument that ended in a public beheading on a cold January morning in 1649 had been building for decades before a single shot was fired in anger. It was an argument about the most fundamental question a kingdom could ask itself. In the final moment, when a king and the law disagree, which one yields? Charles I answered that question with the same unwavering certainty he brought to everything the king yields to nothing, because the king's authority comes from God, and no court assembled by men has jurisdiction over a mandate given by heaven. His opponents answered it differently, and they had an army. The execution was not a revolution in the sense of a sudden popular uprising. It was the terminal point of a philosophical disagreement that had been accumulating force for a generation, and it arrived with the cold, deliberate quality of something that had been decided long before anyone admitted it out loud. Charles had inherited the throne in 1625 from his father James I, and with it he inherited James's absolute conviction that kings were appointed by God and accountable to God alone, a doctrine called the divine right of kings that sounded like theology but functioned in practice as a refusal to be governed. James had managed to maintain this position while still engaging with Parliament often enough to keep it functional. Charles could not or would not do the same. He dissolved Parliament 3 times in the first 4 years of his reign when it failed to give him the money and support he wanted without conditions. In 1629, after a session in which members of Parliament physically held the Speaker down in his chair to prevent him from adjourning an act so extraordinary that people present described it in disbelieving terms. Afterward, Charles dissolved Parliament entirely and resolved to govern without it. He would not summon it again for 11 years. The 11 years of personal rule were the years when the argument calcified into something that could only be resolved by force. Charles raised money through medieval levies that had not been used in generations: ship money, a tax originally charged to coastal towns for naval defense, extended inland to the entire country, and collected year after year without parliamentary approval. He imposed religious reforms through his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, that pushed the Church of England in a direction so close to Catholic ceremony that the Puritan wing of English Protestantism felt itself under direct attack. And then he tried to impose a new prayer book on Scotland, whose church had been Presbyterian for decades and whose population regarded bishops as instruments of oppression. The Scots responded with a national covenant, a public declaration of resistance signed by tens of thousands, and then with an army. Charles had provoked a war he did not have the money to fight, and the only place to get the money was Parliament, the institution he had spent 11 years demonstrating he did not need. When Parliament was recalled in 1640, it arrived with 11 years of stored fury and no intention of simply providing funds and going home. It abolished ship money. It passed acts, making it illegal to dissolve Parliament without Parliament's own consent. It impeached and eventually executed Archbishop Laud. It stripped the crown of the prerogative courts that had been its instruments of control. Charles accepted some of this, resisted some of it, and in January 1642 made the decision that transformed a constitutional crisis into a war. He walked into the House of Commons with 400 soldiers to arrest 5 members of Parliament he had identified as leaders of the opposition. The 5 men had been warned and were not there. The House was silent as Charles looked around the empty chamber and said, in words immediately committed to memory by every person present, that he saw the birds had flown. He left to discover that London had turned against him. Within months, both sides were raising armies. The English Civil War was not a clean conflict between clearly defined sides. It split families, communities, and counties along lines that were partly religious, partly regional, partly class-based, and partly simply a matter of which powerful local family had decided which way to align itself. Roughly speaking, the parliamentary side, the Roundheads, drew its strength from the towns, the merchants, the Puritan gentry, and London itself. The Royalists drew from the rural nobility, the conservative church, and the north and west of the country. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides believed, with the genuine conviction that makes civil wars so brutal, that they were fighting for something sacred. What separated them, in the end, was Oliver Cromwell, a Huntingdonshire gentleman farmer who turned out to have a talent for military organization and cavalry tactics that no one, including himself, had discovered before the war gave him the opportunity. Cromwell's new model army, professional, disciplined, paid regularly, recruited on merit rather than aristocratic connection, defeated the Royalist forces decisively at the Battle of Naseby in June 1645. Charles fled to the Scots, who handed him back to Parliament in exchange for money owed them. He was held in various houses across England, comfortable enough in his confinement to spend the time negotiating with every faction simultaneously and making secret promises to the Scots that, when discovered, convinced the parliamentary radicals who had not yet called for his execution that he could never be safely left alive. A second brief civil war in 1648, triggered by a Scottish invasion Charles had secretly encouraged from his captivity, ended any remaining argument about what to do with him. In December 1648, Colonel Pride stood at the doors of Parliament with a regiment of soldiers and turned away or arrested all the members who were known to favour negotiating with the king rather than trying him. What was left the Rump Parliament was small enough and radical enough to do what needed to be done. The trial opened in Westminster Hall on the 20th of January 1649. Charles wore black throughout. He carried a cane whose silver tip fell off during the first session and rolled across the floor, and he waited for someone to pick it up and no one came, and he bent down and retrieved it himself, a tiny, devastating moment of a man discovering in real time that the ordinary deferences of kingship had been withdrawn. He refused to remove his hat in court. He refused to enter a plea. He challenged the court's authority to try him in words that were legally coherent and politically irrelevant. He argued that no court could sit in judgment of a king without the king's consent, and that a king who submitted to such a court would be betraying not just himself but every future king and every subject who depended on the protection of sacred kingship. The court did not engage with the argument. It convicted him of being a tyrant, a traitor, and a murderer, and sentenced him to death by the removal of his head from his body. On the morning of the 30th of January 1649, Charles dressed with exceptional care, asking for an extra shirt so that the cold would not make him shiver on the scaffold, because he did not want anyone to mistake his shivering for fear. He was walked through street, James's Park to the banqueting house, the great ceremonial hall he had used for court masques and royal entertainments, the ceiling of which bore paintings by Rubens, commissioned by his own father, celebrating the divine authority of the Stuart monarchy. He walked beneath those paintings and stepped out through a first-floor window onto the scaffold that had been built against the wall outside. He spoke briefly to the crowd, too briefly for most of them to hear, saying that he died a Christian, that he forgave his enemies, that the people's liberty consisted in having government under the law and not in sharing government. Then he lay down and placed his neck on the block, and the executioner, whose identity was hidden and has never been definitively established, brought the axe down in a single clean blow. The sound the crowd made was reported by witnesses again and again in the days and weeks afterward, each one groping for words adequate to it. It was not a cheer, it was not weeping, it was a communal exhalation that contained both, and beneath them something that was neither the sound of thousands of people absorbing, at the same instant, the full weight of what had just been done and the fact that it could not be taken back. A king was not a man. A king was an idea, a structure, a guarantee against a certain kind of chaos. England had just killed the idea on purpose. Nobody in the crowd, regardless of which side they had been on, knew what came next. What came next was 11 years of discovering that removing a king does not automatically produce something better. The Commonwealth and then the Protectorate under Cromwell governed England with an efficiency that frequently tipped into repression. Cromwell's rule of the country through military major generals in 1655 was as authoritarian as anything Charles had attempted, and rather less elegant about it. When Cromwell died in September 1658, and his son Richard proved utterly unequal to holding the regime together, the army and parliament entered a spiral of mutual paralysis, so complete that within 18 months the country had exhausted every alternative and arrived at the only one remaining. Charles II, in exile in Europe since his father's death, was invited home. He rode into London on his 30th birthday in May 1660, while the crowds lining the streets were so large and so loud that diarists noted you could not hear the person beside you speak. The monarchy was back. The men who had signed Charles I's death warrant were tracked down with methodical patience over the following years, some executed, some imprisoned for life, some fleeing into permanent exile. The king had returned. But England was not the same country it had been before the axe fell, and the men who ran it knew it. The idea that a ruler was above the law had been tried, had been argued, had been fought over, and had lost not just the argument but the man who embodied it. The next time the English needed to remove a king, they would find a way to do it without a scaffold. And that lesson, learned at the cost of a king's life, would produce the most quietly consequential revolution in English history. England had already learned, at enormous cost, that removing a king by force produced consequences that could not be controlled. The trial, the axe, the 11 years of republic, the republic's failure, the restoration, all of it had burned the country badly enough that when the next crisis came, the men who shaped it were determined to do it differently. Not with a scaffold, not with a civil war, not with a public act of violence that would require decades of justification and revenge. The glorious revolution of 1688 was, in this sense, a revolution designed by people who had studied the last one and refused to repeat it. It was careful, deliberate, and conducted with a controlled speed that left its target almost no time to organize a defense. And it worked so completely, and left so little wreckage behind, that the world it created has been mistaken ever since for something that was always there. James II had been king for 3 years when the crisis arrived, and the crisis had been visible from the first day of his reign to anyone paying attention. He was Catholic, openly, unambiguously, defiantly Catholic in a country that had spent 60 years building its national identity around being Protestant, that had executed Catholics for practicing their faith, that had a legally established Church of England whose entire existence was premised on the rejection of Rome. His Protestantism subjects had accepted him as king, not because they trusted him, but because they calculated he was survivable. He was in his early 50s. His 2 daughters by his first wife, Mary and Anne, both Protestant, both of age, stood between England and a Catholic succession. All the country had to do was wait for a Catholic king to be followed by Protestant queens, and the crisis would solve itself through the ordinary workings of mortality. James made waiting very difficult. He placed Catholic officers in the army in defiance of the Test Acts that legally excluded them. He appointed Catholics to civil positions and to the Privy Council. He issued a declaration of indulgence in 1687 suspending the laws that penalized Catholic and Protestant nonconformist worship alike, a gesture framed as tolerance but understood by the political nation as an attempt to build a Catholic-friendly coalition that bypassed Parliament entirely. When 7 bishops refused to read the declaration from their pulpits and published their reasons, James had them arrested and tried for seditious libel. The jury acquitted them. The crowds outside the courthouse cheered so loudly and so long that the sound reportedly reached the king at Whitehall. James heard it and, one imagines, understood what it meant and refused to act on the understanding. The birth of a son on the 10th of June 1688 was the moment the calculation collapsed. A healthy Catholic boy, legitimately born, now stood ahead of Mary and Anne in the line of succession. The temporary problem had just become permanent. Within weeks of the birth, rumors were already circulating, encouraged, manufactured, and spread by people with strong political reasons to manufacture them that the baby was not James's real son at all, that the Queen had not actually been pregnant, that the child had been smuggled into the royal bedchamber in a warming pan to produce a false Catholic heir. The warming pan story was almost certainly false. It was believed anyway, or at least cited as justification by people who needed a justification, because the alternative, admitting they were removing a king simply because they did not want a Catholic dynasty, was a harder argument to make in public. The letter that 7 of England's most powerful men, nobles and bishops, the kind of figures whose names alone carried political weight, sent to William of Orange in the Netherlands in late June 1688, was one of the most consequential pieces of correspondence in English history, and it was written in terms deliberately vague enough that if it were intercepted, its signatories could plausibly deny its meaning. It said, in essence, that 19 in 20 Englishmen wished for a change, that William's coming would be welcomed, and that the signatories would support him the moment he landed. What it did not say explicitly, what it left to be understood, was that they were inviting him to take the English throne. William had been watching England for years with the focused attention of a man whose primary concern was building and maintaining a European coalition against the French King Louis XIV, and who understood that an England allied with France under a Catholic king was a strategic catastrophe for everything he was trying to build. He accepted the invitation with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for it. William's fleet of roughly 500 ships landed at Torbay in Devon on the 5th of November 1688. A date whose symbolism, falling on the anniversary of the gunpowder plot, was almost certainly deliberate. James had an army. On paper, he had a sufficient force to meet William in the field and contest the invasion militarily. What he did not have was an army that was willing to fight for him. The defections began almost immediately and accumulated with a momentum that became self-reinforcing. Each commander who went over to William made it more rational for the next one to do the same, and less rational for anyone still loyal to James to believe that loyalty would be rewarded with anything except defeat. John Churchill, the most capable military commander in England and the man James had most relied upon for his army's effectiveness, defected in the first week of November. James's son-in-law George, Prince of Denmark, followed, and then, in a desertion that broke something in James that military defections alone had not reached, his daughter Anne slipped away from her apartments in the middle of the night and joined the opposition. His own child had chosen William over him. James assembled what remained of his forces and advanced toward William's position, then stopped, then retreated, then began bleeding men from his camp at a rate that made further advance meaningless. He sent commissioners to negotiate. He agreed to call a free parliament. He appeared, to the men around him, to be managing the crisis with some remnant of political competence. And then, in the early hours of December 11, he dismantled everything. He burned the writs he had issued for elections, attempting to make a new parliament constitutionally impossible. He dropped the Great Seal of England, the object through which royal authority was formally exercised, without which no official act of government could be legally sealed into the Thames from a boat in the darkness, apparently intending to paralyze the state machinery rather than allow it to function against him. And then he fled. He was caught at the Kent coast, trying to board a ship, brought back to London, and in a move of breathtaking political pragmatism allowed by William to escape a second time, because a king in exile was easier to manage than a king under arrest awaiting trial, and no one wanted another trial, another scaffold, another sound from the crowd that no one knew how to describe.